She buried her name somewhere in the Nebraska mud, 3 states back, beside a broken wagon wheel and everything she used to be. The woman who stepped off that rattling stagecoach into the teeth of a Wyoming wind was not Clara Weston. Clara Weston was wanted. Clara Weston was ruined. Clara Weston had made the mistake of trusting the wrong man with everything she owned and everything she was. The woman who stepped onto that frozen dirt road smoothed her worn coat, lifted her chin against the cold, and answered only to Evelyn Hart. She had approximately 4 minutes before she met the man who would decide whether she lived or starved, and she could not afford a single tremor in her voice. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that a man on horseback had watched that stagecoach for the last 60 miles. And he wasn't there to take luggage. If you're already hooked, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Hit that like button and stay with Evelyn all the way to the end. You're going to want to see how this one turns out. The stagecoach from Rawlins smelled like wet wool, nervous sweat, and the faint copper undertone of someone's old fear, which was fitting because Evelyn Hart was manufacturing fresh fear with every rotation of the wheels beneath her. She sat wedged between a heavy-set cattle broker who slept with his mouth open and a thin woman in black morning dress who hadn't spoken since Lander. Evelyn had her hands folded in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone who has learned that the wrong movement at the wrong moment draws exactly the kind of attention that gets you killed, or worse, recognized. Outside the smeared window, Wyoming was doing what Wyoming did in late March. Threatening. The sky sat low and gray over the Wind River Range like a ceiling about to collapse. What little snow had melted in the brief warmth of 2 weeks prior had refrozen overnight into a treacherous skin of black ice across the road, and the driver had been swearing at his horses in a steady creative stream for the past hour. The cottonwoods along the creek beds were gray sticks. The sage was the color of old pewter. There wasn't a single soft thing anywhere in this landscape, and Evelyn had decided that was exactly why she'd chosen it. Soft places forgave nothing. Hard places, at least, were honest about it. She pressed 2 fingers against the inside of her coat pocket, felt the folded paper there. The letter from the employment agency out of Denver. Position available. Domestic housekeeper. Wind River Valley homestead. Wages negotiable. References required. She had provided references. 2 of them. Both entirely fictitious, both written in her own careful hand on paper purchased from a shop in Cheyenne where no one knew her face. Clara Weston had once been meticulous about honesty. It had served her beautifully right up until the moment it destroyed her. Evelyn Hart had learned to be meticulous about survival instead. The coach lurched hard to the left. The cattle broker startled awake with a grunt, grabbed his hat, and peered out the window with the suspicious expression of a man who expected the world to be misbehaving. "How much farther?" Evelyn asked the window rather than anyone in particular. 20 minutes, maybe." The cattle broker resettled his hat. "You headed to Mercer's place?" She looked at him carefully. "I'm headed to the valley. Only reason a woman rides out this far alone without kin meeting her is either she's going to the Lander settlement or she's the new hire at Mercer's, and you don't look like a settlement woman." He said it without malice, just the flat assessment of a man who spent his working life sizing up what things were worth. Silas Mercer's a fair enough sort. Keeps to himself. Don't talk much. But he's square. "I appreciate the reassurance," Evelyn said, in a tone that did not invite further conversation. The woman in morning dress turned her head slightly, as though she'd heard something interesting and then turned back to the window. Evelyn did not ask the cattle broker anything else. She didn't need information about Silas Mercer from a stranger on a coach. She needed to arrive, establish herself, and become indispensable before anyone thought to look too carefully at her papers. That was the plan. Simple as a stone and twice as heavy. The coach stopped at a crossroads that barely deserved the name. 2 frozen dirt tracks meeting at a lone post with a weathered board nailed to it. The board read Mercer with an arrow pointing northeast. Evelyn climbed down before the driver had fully set the brake. She pulled her traveling bag after her. 1 bag, 23 pounds, everything she owned that wasn't already left behind, and stood in the road while the cold hit her like an open hand. It was a different kind of cold than she'd known in Ohio. Ohio cold was damp and gray and miserable. This cold was violent. It had intentions. It came down off the mountains with purpose, found every gap in her coat, and made itself at home. The coach rattled on without ceremony. She stood alone at the crossroads for a moment that felt significantly longer than it was, her bag at her feet, the wind pulling at the loose hair beneath her hat, and looked northeast toward whatever waited at the end of that track. "You've done harder things," she told herself. "You've done harder things, and you did not die." This was not entirely true, but it was the kind of lie worth keeping. She picked up her bag and started walking. Otet. The ranch came into view after a mile and a half of track that seemed designed to discourage the faint of heart. It appeared first as a dark shape against the pale sky. A main house, low and long, built of squared timber with a covered porch running the full length of the front. Behind it, 2 outbuildings and a barn large enough to mean serious cattle operation, not a homesteader's small hope. A corral with 4 horses standing in the cold, enduring it with the stoic patience of horses everywhere. A woodpile stacked so neatly against the side of the house that it looked almost architectural. Everything about the place said, "Someone lives here who means to stay." Evelyn adjusted her bag, squared her shoulders, and walked the last quarter-mile to the gate. She was 20 feet away when the front door opened. Silas Mercer was not what she had assembled in her imagination during the 3 weeks since she'd accepted the position by post. She'd pictured someone older, grayer, the sort of widowed or bachelor rancher who hired housekeeping help because he'd let things go to ruin and needed someone to fight the disorder on his behalf. She'd pictured someone easy to manage, not unkind but predictable, simple, the kind of man whose attention stayed on his cattle and his land and who would leave a hired woman to do her work in peace. The man who came off that porch was perhaps 40, possibly less. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has learned that the mountains don't reward panic and that everything worth doing is worth doing at the pace that gets it done right. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that weather had worked on for years, not battered, but finished, the way good leather gets finished. Lines at the corners of his eyes that could have been from squinting into sun and wind, or could have been from something else entirely. He stopped at the gate post and looked at her with gray eyes that were doing something she couldn't quite name, not unfriendly, but very careful. "Miss Hart," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Mercer." She met his eyes. This was critical. People who had something to hide usually couldn't hold eye contact for more than 3 seconds. Evelyn had practiced in every mirror and still window she'd encountered for the past month. "I apologize for arriving later than expected. The stage was delayed out of Rollins." "I know. Heard the road south was rough." He opened the gate. It swung smoothly, well-maintained, the kind of gate a careful man kept in order. "You walked from the crossroads." "I did." He looked at her bag, looked at her boots, which were good boots, her one real vanity, sturdy and well-oiled, and then looked back at her face. "Come inside. There's coffee." She followed him through the gate and across the yard, watching the ground because the ice was treacherous and she was not going to fall on her first day. She was also, with the part of her mind that never fully rested anymore, noting the layout. The barn door, the outbuilding closest to the house, a smokehouse from the smell. The window placement, the single track in and out, old habits. She hated them and could not stop them. The inside of the house surprised her. It was clean. Not a bachelor's reluctant clean, where someone has pushed things into corners before company arrives, but genuinely, daily clean. The plank floors were swept. The window glass was clear. There was a wood stove in the main room with a fire already built and breathing, and the room itself was furnished sparingly but with intention. A table of solid construction, 4 chairs, a shelf of books that had actually been read, she could tell by the spines, a braided rug that had seen years of use but hadn't been neglected. No woman's touches, but no woman's neglect either. She set her bag down near the door, kept her coat on until invited otherwise, and took in the room the way she'd learned to take in every room. Exits, valuables, potential weapons, places to hide something small. There was a door in the back of the main room, closed. A narrow staircase going up, a kitchen area to the left with a larger stove and a workbench that needed serious attention. This was where the bachelor had showed, in the stack of unwashed pans and the flour barrel left open. "Sit," Silas said, not unkindly, nodding at the table. He went to the kitchen stove and poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that had been sitting there since morning, from the smell, thick, black, and unrepentant. He set a cup in front of her and sat across the table with his own. "You came from Denver," he said. "From the agency in Denver, yes." Before that? A half-beat of silence, controlled. "Ohio, originally. I've been working in the West for the past 2 years." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "The reference letters from my previous employers are in my bag. I was told you'd requested them." "I did." He didn't ask to see them immediately, which was either a good sign or the kind of sign that meant he'd already looked into her by some other method. "Mrs. Hartley at the agency said you have experience with large household management and some medical knowledge." "I do. I worked 3 years in a household in Columbus before my husband's death. After that, I took a position in a ranch kitchen outside of Colorado Springs. I know how to manage stores, preserve food, manage a kitchen operation, basic wound care, and I'm not afraid of hard work in cold weather." She'd said this exactly 4 times in her head before saying it aloud, until it felt natural. It was true, all of it, just attached to the wrong name. "I'm not looking for an easy post, Mr. Mercer. I'm looking for steady work and fair treatment." "That's what I'm offering," he said. "Then I believe we'll get along." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. That careful look again, the one she couldn't quite classify. Not suspicion, she knew what suspicion looked like, had learned to read it the way a sailor reads weather. Something more like patience with a purpose. "I run cattle," he said, "with a crew of 3 hired hands who work the range in winter in the bunkhouse. They take their meals there. I eat in the house. Your work is the house. Cooking, managing the stores, cleaning, whatever needs doing. I'll expect you to manage your domain and leave mine to me. I don't need to be checked on." "I don't make a habit of checking on anyone," Evelyn said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Good. I'll show you your room." The room was small and off the kitchen, cold in winter, probably hot in summer, with a single window that faced east so she'd get the morning light. A narrow bed with a wool blanket and a quilted coverlet, a washstand, a small dresser, and a hook on the back of the door. There was a braided rag rug on the floor, newer than the one in the main room. She stood in the doorway and took a quiet breath. "It's fine," she said. "I know it's not much. I didn't come here for much, Mr. Mercer. I came here to work." He nodded once, a short, precise nod, and left her to it. She stood in the middle of the small room after his footsteps retreated, her traveling bag at her feet, the muffled sound of wind against the east wall, and let herself have exactly 30 seconds of feeling whatever it was she was feeling. The tightness in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite grief, and was, she had learned, simply the permanent state of a woman running on borrowed time and a borrowed name. Then she unpacked her bag, organized her few things into the dresser with the same neat efficiency she'd applied to everything since leaving Ohio, and went out to see what the kitchen situation actually was. It was bad. She made a list. Nut. His hands came in for the midday meal, which, on her first day, she managed with the flour and salt pork and dried beans she found in the pantry, because she had decided on the stagecoach that the fastest way to make herself necessary was to feed people well before they had time to form an opinion about her. 3 men. Older one named Cass, who walked with a bad knee and had the slow, considered speech of someone who'd been hit in the head once too often by something heavy. A younger man, barely 20, probably less, named Doyle, who ate like he was afraid someone would take his plate and talked to fill any silence within 10 feet of him. And a third man, quiet, Cherokee by his features and the way he read the land when he walked across the yard, who Silas called Webb, and who nodded once at Evelyn when introduced and thereafter paid her no attention whatsoever, which she appreciated more than she could say. They ate. She fed them. This was a simple transaction, and she understood it completely. Doyle said, "This is better than what old Pete used to make." "What happened to old Pete?" she asked, because it was the natural question. "Rheumatism got bad," Cass said around a biscuit. "Couldn't stay through winter anymore. Went south to his sister in New Mexico." "And before him?" Cass and Doyle exchanged a glance. Webb looked at the wall. "Before him was a couple others that didn't stay," Doyle said. "This country ain't for everybody." "I'm aware," Evelyn said pleasantly, and refilled his coffee. After they'd gone back to the barn, she stood at the kitchen window washing the pots and watched Silas Mercer come out of the house and cross the yard to the corral. He stopped at the fence and stood there a while, looking at something in the middle distance rather than the horses in front of him. He had his arms crossed on the top rail, head slightly bent, the way a man looks when he is thinking something through very carefully. She watched him for a moment longer than she should have, then turned back to her dishes. 3 days passed. She established her territory in the kitchen the way she'd been told you had to establish territory in the West, quietly, completely, and without asking anyone's permission. She reorganized the pantry, found the root cellar by the back of the barn, and inventoried what was stored there. Made a list of what needed to be ordered when the supply wagon came through from Lander. Fixed the hinge on the kitchen door that had been scraping for what looked like months. Started a bone broth from the beef bones she found frozen in the smokehouse and let it run all day on the back of the stove until the whole house smelled like something worth coming home to. She did not go through Silas Mercer's papers. She thought about it. She was honest with herself, the same bitter honesty that kept her alive. And she thought about it once in the small hours of the second night when she couldn't sleep and the wind was doing something violent against the roof. She thought, he knows something, he has something. Understanding what he knows could tell me how much danger I'm in. She rolled over and pressed her face against the pillow and did not get up. Because here was the thing about stealing another look at someone's private business. It never stayed small. One looked-at letter became two, became a habit, became the kind of woman she had never wanted to be, even when she was Clara Weston, and she was not going to become her in a cold ranch house in Wyoming simply because she was frightened. She was frightened all the time. It didn't mean she got to make bad choices. On the fourth morning, she was elbow-deep in bread dough when Silas came in through the back door, stomping ice off his boots, looked at what she was doing and said, "There's something wrong with the pantry door latch. Has been for a while." "I know," she said. "I left it for you because I didn't know if you wanted it handled the way I'd handle it, or your way." He stopped, looked at her. "What's your way?" "I take the hinge apart, clean it, reset the pin, and use a wedge of cedar at the bottom to stop the swing from going too far in cold weather. Whole thing takes maybe 30 minutes. "Do it your way," he said, and went back outside. She kept working the dough, kept her face neutral, and permitted herself a small, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with romance or even liking the man, just the clean satisfaction of a professional establishing that she knew what she was doing. That's right. On the 6th day, a letter arrived with the weekly rider who brought mail out from Lander. Silas sorted through it at the table after supper, standing the way men do when they expect it won't take long. Evelyn was at the kitchen stove and heard the soft sound of envelopes being set aside, one by one, until one apparently warranted a second look. She kept her eyes on the pot she was minding. After a moment, she heard the letter set down, heard the chair scrape, heard Silas move toward the window. She could feel him standing there in the way you feel the presence of someone whose attention has sharpened. Ryder said this came through the territorial marshal's office to the Lander Post, Silas said. Evelyn's hand was on the pot handle. She did not move it. "Is that unusual?" "Depends on the letter." A pause. Long enough to mean something. "Correspondence goes through the marshal's relay for a lot of reasons out here. Missing persons, land disputes, bounties." Another pause. "Investigations?" "Yes," she said carefully. "I'd imagine it would." She turned and met his eyes across the room because she was not going to flinch. He was watching her with that careful, patient look, the letter folded in his hand, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The fire in the stove made its small sound. The wind pushed against the north wall. "You sleep all right last night?" he said. The shift in subject was so abrupt it took her a half-second to follow it. "Well enough," he nodded. Folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. "There's ice on the north fence line. I need to check it in the morning. I'll be gone most of the day." "I'll have something ready for when you get back." He went to bed. She stood at the stove another 20 minutes, listening to the ranch settle into its night sounds, her heart beating in a slow, deliberate way that she had trained herself to maintain through sheer force of a will built out of necessity. The letter. She knew what it was about. She had known this moment would come, had been calculating the odds since Colorado, since she'd first understood how wide the net was being cast and how few places were outside its reach. The federal marshals had long arms, longer than she'd hoped. The question was whether Silas Mercer had recognized the name in that letter. And the second question, harder and with sharper edges, was whether it would matter. Bob. She lay in the small room that night listening to the wind work itself into a rage outside, and let herself think about Clara Weston in the way she almost never allowed, clearly without flinching. Clara Weston had been a widow for 8 months when Arthur Price came through Columbus with a proposition. He'd presented himself as an investment broker with connections to Western Railroad development, and he'd had the papers to prove it, the letterhead and the introductory letters from men of substance whose names Clara had checked, or thought she'd checked. She understood now, too late, in the manner in which most crucial understandings arrive, that Arthur Price was exceptional at constructing the appearance of legitimacy. She hadn't been greedy. That was the part that still lived like a splinter under her skin. She hadn't been greedy or reckless or stupid. She had been careful, and it hadn't been enough because Arthur Price was careful too, and had a 20-year head start at the specific skill of making careful people trust him. She'd invested what remained of her late husband's estate, not wildly, not everything at once, but in measured amounts over 6 months as the venture reports arrived on schedule, as the promised returns began to materialize in small, credible increments. She'd introduced 3 other women in her social circle. She'd written a letter of endorsement to a banker she knew slightly, who'd passed it on. By the time the edifice collapsed, 43 people across 4 states had lost money to Arthur Price's construction company that had never broken ground on a single piece of land. Clara Weston wasn't the largest victim by any measure, but she was the one whose letter of endorsement had drawn in several of the others, and there were people who thought that meant something more than naivety. The federal investigation had begun when Price disappeared, as men like him always do, into the machinery of a country too large to contain its criminals properly. She'd known investigators were coming before they arrived because Sarah Henley, a woman in her circle who'd been on the periphery of the whole affair, had warned her. "They're asking about everyone who introduced others," Sarah had said. "They're asking about where the money went and who benefited." Clara had not benefited. Clara had lost as much as anyone. But Clara had also understood, with the specific clarity of a woman who'd spent her adult life reading the way systems worked, that investigations don't always follow the truth. They follow the available evidence, and the available evidence could be arranged to look like almost anything. She'd left Columbus on a Thursday morning and hadn't stopped. She didn't think of it as running. Running was what guilty people did. She thought of it as refusing to become the convenient answer to a question someone else had asked. It didn't always feel that different. On the 9th day, Silas Mercer did something unexpected. He came into the kitchen in the early afternoon. Not his usual pattern. He was a man of routine, and afternoons were for the range, and sat down at the table without being invited in the way a man sits down in his own house who has suddenly found himself with something on his mind. She was cutting dried apples for a cobbler. She kept cutting. "Where are you from originally?" he said. Not like he didn't know, like he was opening a door and leaving her the option of which way to go through it. "Ohio," she said. "I told you that." "What part?" "Columbus." This was true. There was no lie in Columbus. "I was through Columbus once," he said. 68, 69. "Coming out west." "What part of Columbus?" "Near the University District." Also true. He was quiet for a moment. "You have people back there?" "No," she said. This was also true, in all the ways that mattered. "My husband died in 77. We didn't have children. His family and I weren't close." She set the knife down and looked at him directly. "Is there something specific you're asking me, Mr. Mercer?" He met her eyes without any shift in that careful, patient expression. "Not yet," he said. He got up and went back outside. "Not yet." She picked up the knife and kept working, and tried to decide whether those 2 words were a warning or something closer to a promise. That night, she dreamed about Arthur Price's hands. Not his face, she'd long stopped dreaming about his face, but his hands, which had been elegant and steady and completely without tremor, even when he was lying through every tooth in his head. She woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of one of the horses making noise in the corral, heart pounding. The dream already dissolving, but the feeling of it remaining. That particular cold dread of something pursuing you that is both real and specifically personal. She got up, pulled on her coat over her nightclothes, her feet into boots at the door, and stepped out into the yard. The cold hit her so hard she gasped. This cold, this mountain cold. She'd been here 9 days and she still wasn't entirely used to it. The sky was absolutely clear, and the stars above the Wind River Range were so dense and so bright they looked structural, like the sky needed them to hold itself up. The horse that had been making noise was settled. She could see him through the corral fence, one of the gray geldings, standing still now, ears up, watching something she couldn't see in the dark past the fence line. She stood in the yard and breathed and looked at those stars, and made herself think clearly. The letter had come through the Marshal's relay. Silas Mercer had read it. He hadn't confronted her. He had instead asked careful questions in a way that was not confrontation, but was also not casual. Not yet. He was a man who worked through things methodically. She'd watched him with the cattle operation, with his crew, with the 100 small decisions a ranch demanded. He didn't react. He considered. What did a man like that do when he discovered his new housekeeper was not who she claimed to be? She didn't know. And not knowing was the thing she was least able to tolerate. The gray gelding turned and walked to the far side of the corral. Whatever had caught his attention apparently resolved. Evelyn stood in the Wyoming dark a few minutes longer, then went back inside, took off her coat and boots, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time, thinking about what it might mean to tell a partial truth. Not everything. Not yet. But enough of the shape of things that if Silas Mercer had already started to understand who she was, the revelation would at least come from her mouth, rather than someone else's. She thought about this for an hour. She decided at the end of the hour that she was not ready, that the timing was wrong, that 9 days wasn't enough foundation to build anything on. She went back to bed and didn't sleep again until nearly dawn. Doyle broke his wrist on a day when the temperature dropped hard and fast, and the ice in the corral caught him wrong when a colt spooked. She heard the shout from the kitchen and was outside before she'd thought about it, moving across the yard the way she'd learned to move on ice. Small steps, weight-centered, not fighting the surface. Doyle was on the ground with Cass crouched over him, and Webb standing back with the horses settled under his hands, his face giving nothing away but his eyes, tracking her quickly as she came through the corral gate. "Let me see," she said. Cass looked up at her like he was considering whether a housekeeper's hands were the right hands for this moment. And then Doyle made a sound that settled the question, and Cass moved. She'd seen broken wrists before. Her husband had broken the same wrist twice, once from a fall, and once from a very stupid argument with a wagon jack. Doyle's was a clean break from the look of the swelling, not compound, nothing pushed through skin. Bad enough. Bad enough to need setting and splinting and keeping still, which was going to be a significant argument with the 20-year-old who thought sitting still was for people who'd already died. "I need 2 straight pieces of wood about this long," she told Cass, demonstrating the length with her hands. "And strips of cloth. And get him inside out of this cold." Cass went. Webb picked Doyle up off the ground with the efficiency of a man who's moved injured people before, and Doyle, to his credit, swore continuously but didn't fight it. Silas came in from the north fence line while she was setting the wrist, appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at the situation, and stood back. She didn't look at him. She had both hands occupied, and Doyle was gripping the table edge white-knuckled, and she needed her attention where it was. "You're doing fine," she told Doyle quietly. Not because it was meaningfully helpful, but because the voice was something to focus on. "Don't look at it. Look at the window. Tell me something useless." "What?" Doyle gasped. "Tell me something. Anything. What's the name of the worst horse you ever tried to ride?" "Domino," Doyle managed, sucking air. "Spotted bastard. Out of a ranch near Casper. Tell me about Domino." He talked. She worked. Cass stood in the corner with his arms crossed, looking like he was watching surgery, which she supposed this was, approximately. Webb appeared in the doorway with strips of sheeting he'd found somewhere, handed them to Cass, and disappeared again. When it was done, she stepped back and looked at her work. Straight enough. The swelling would be bad by tomorrow, but the bones were where they needed to be. "Keep it raised," she told Doyle. "Don't use it. Don't think about using it. If the fingers go numb or turn blue, you come find me immediately." Doyle was pale, but had stopped making sounds. "You've done that before," he said. "Twice," she said. From the doorway, Silas said, Good work, in the quiet, direct way he said everything, and went back outside. She stood at the wash basin cleaning her hands and let the small warmth of that, the uncomplicated acknowledgement of a thing done well, settle somewhere in her chest where the cold usually lived. That evening, Silas Mercer came in from the barn later than usual. She had supper on venison stew and biscuits, not inventive, but solid and hot, the kind of food a cold man needed. She had the lamp on the table and the stove burning, and the room was the warmest it had been since she arrived. He came in, sat down, and ate without conversation. She sat at the other end of the table with her own bowl because she'd established early that she wasn't going to stand and serve while men ate in her kitchen. About halfway through, he said, "Where'd you learn to set a bone?" "My husband's physician showed me," she said. "My husband was clumsy." She paused. "And also reckless, which is a different problem." "Was he a good man otherwise?" She considered this. "He was a kind man," she said. "Kind and not particularly ambitious. He didn't leave me much when he died. But he didn't leave me debts either, which I've come to think of as its own form of generosity." Silas ate. The stove made its sounds. "My wife died in 75, he said. Not like he was offering something. More like he was placing a fact on the table between them, something she could look at or not as she chose. Fever. Took her in 3 days. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "It's been a while." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Takes a while after that before a house feels like a house again." She understood this exactly. "Yes," she said, "it does." They finished supper without speaking again, but it was a different kind of silence, less careful, less defended, more like the silence of two people who have established, tentatively, that they are both carrying things and have decided not to demand the other set theirs down. She cleared the table. He sat with his coffee. And she thought, he is not what I expected. She wasn't sure yet whether that made things better or worse. The letter came again. Not a second letter. The same letter, she realized, when she saw it lying on the table the next morning after Silas had gone out early. He'd left it there, on the table, folded, in the exact center of the space between where he sat and where she sat. She stood very still looking at it for a good 10 seconds. Then she sat down, placed both hands flat on the table on either side of it, and thought very hard about the kind of person she intended to be. She did not open it. She got up, started the stove for breakfast, and when Silas came in an hour later, he looked at the letter where she'd left it, exactly where he'd put it, and then looked at her. She met his eyes. "That's not mine to open," she said. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, more like a thing he'd been waiting to see, confirmed. "No," he agreed and picked it up and put it back in his coat. "It isn't." She put biscuits on the table and poured his coffee, and they sat down to breakfast, and neither of them mentioned it again. But something had shifted. She could feel it, the way you feel the change in air pressure before a storm. Not the storm yet, but its approach, and the understanding that what came with it was not entirely within her control. She was not, she thought, afraid of Silas Mercer. She was not entirely sure what she was. Chat. 2 weeks. Then 3. The Wyoming spring advanced with its characteristic bad faith, warm days that promised something and then yanked it back behind a new front of snow, ice that retreated and returned, mud that made the yard crossing a daily negotiation. She learned the ranch in the way you learn a difficult piece of music, slowly, by repetition, making mistakes and correcting them until the movement became second nature. She learned that the well cover needed to be weighted differently in wind. She learned that Webb had a bad reaction to something in dried chili peppers, and she needed to cook around it. She learned that Cass's knee predicted weather with better accuracy than anything she could see in the sky, and she learned to watch which way he favored it in the mornings. She learned that Silas Mercer read late by lamplight, that he kept a journal she never saw the inside of, that he was the kind of man who fixed things himself rather than asking, and that he occasionally stood at the north fence in the late afternoon for 20 minutes, doing nothing at all but watching the mountains. She learned that his silence was not emptiness. It was the silence of a man with a great deal in his head that he had not yet chosen to say. She did not learn what was in the letter, but she was beginning to understand that the letter, whatever it contained, was not the thing she actually needed to be afraid of. What she needed to be afraid of was the particular, specific growing problem of trusting someone. Because against every screaming instinct built by 18 months of running, she was starting to. Egg. On a morning in the fourth week, she was standing at the kitchen window watching the first genuinely warm light of the year come over the eastern ridge. Pale gold, tentative, the mountains cutting it into long, flat bars across the snow. When she heard Silas's step behind her and turned to find him standing in the kitchen doorway with his coat on and his hat in his hand. "Ryder's going to Lander today," he said. "I have a list of supplies to order. Thought you might want to add to it." She nodded, moved to the table, picked up the pencil she kept near the ledger. "I'll need flour, salt, baking soda, dried kidney beans, 2 bolts of muslin for Doyle's bandage replacement, coffee, and if they have it, any dried fruit, apples or apricots." He watched her write, watched her hand move. She was aware of it, aware of him in the specific way she'd been trying not to be aware of him, which was to say completely. "You have good handwriting," he said. "I went to school longer than most girls did," she said without looking up. "Where?" She finished writing, set the pencil down, looked up at him. "A private school in Columbus. My father was a professor. He thought women should be educated even if the rest of the world hadn't caught up to the idea." She paused. He was right, as it turned out. Silas looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention she'd come to recognize, the kind that didn't press but held. "What did he teach?" "History," she said. "He liked stories about people who made wrong choices and had to figure out how to live with them." The corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, something quieter. "Useful subject," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "It turned out to be." He took the supply list, put his hat on, and went out to the yard. She stood at the kitchen table for a moment with her hands resting on the surface and thought, Clara Weston's father taught history. That part was true. That part had always been true. She wondered, not for the first time and not for the last, what her father would have thought of the woman she was becoming out here in the Wyoming cold, the woman built from necessity and borrowed name and choices made at the edge of desperation. She thought he would have understood the choices, even if he couldn't have approved them. She thought he might even have been proud of how she'd held herself together. She put on her apron and went to start on the day's bread, and the morning light came through the east window and lay on the floor in bars the color of old gold, and the house smelled like coffee and wood smoke and the particular cold, clean air of a Wyoming spring morning opening up at last. Outside, she could hear Silas speaking to one of the horses, not words she could make out, just the low, even cadence of a man reassuring something that didn't fully understand its own situation. She kept her hands in the dough and kept her face steady and did not let herself think too hard about the fact that she understood that horse completely. April arrived without apology. The snow didn't disappear so much as surrender, retreating first from the south-facing slopes, then from the yard, then reluctantly from the shadow of the north wall where it had been holding out with the stubbornness of something that knew its season was ending but refused to acknowledge it. The mud that replaced it was spectacular and total. It got into everything. It clung to boots and pant cuffs and the underside of the kitchen door and required Evelyn to add floor scraping to the list of daily tasks she hadn't anticipated when she'd taken this position. She didn't complain about it. Complaining required an audience willing to sympathize, and she was operating in a world where nobody had hired her for her feelings. Doyle's wrist healed faster than she'd expected, young bones being what they were, and he'd gone from sullen enforced rest to cautious use to, within 3 weeks, acting as though the injury had never happened, which concerned her slightly. She told him so. "You're favoring the outside edge when you grip," she said one morning when he was in the kitchen bothering her for an early biscuit before the breakfast hour. "You think you're using it the same way, but you're not. Keep doing that, and the next time you stress it, it'll go in a different place." Doyle looked at his wrist as though it had betrayed him. "How can you tell that just from watching me pick up a coffee cup?" "Because I've been watching people use broken things for a long time," she said, and handed him the biscuit before he could think too carefully about what she meant. He took it and went, satisfied, which was the thing about Doyle. He wanted food and company and didn't press much beyond that. She'd come to appreciate the simplicity of him. Cash she'd grown comfortable with in a different way, the way you grow comfortable with weather. You understand its patterns, you stop being surprised by it, you work around its moods without taking them personally. Webb remained a closed book she had decided not to try opening, which she suspected was exactly what he preferred. And Silas? Silas remained the question she carried through every day, the way you carry a stone in your boot, aware of it with every step, unable to address it without stopping completely. The supply order came back from Lander. She organized the pantry with the new stores in a way that made the space work better, shifted the flour barrel to the dryer corner, labeled the new shelving with the careful handwriting that was apparently one of the few things about Clara Weston she hadn't been able to leave behind. She found a rhythm. Mornings were bread and breakfast and the day's planning. Midday was the main meal for herself and whoever was near the house. Afternoons she cleaned, repaired, preserved, or managed the 100 small administrative tasks that kept a household running without anyone noticing it was being run. Evenings were supper, and then an hour where she permitted herself to sit at the kitchen table with the lamp and either mend or read from the shelf in the main room, which Silas had told her to use without ceremony. The books were a mixed group, some history, a surveying manual, 2 novels she didn't recognize, a battered medical reference that she found quietly invaluable and read in sections. There was also a law book, Territorial Statutes, Wyoming, dated 1876. She'd pulled it out once, looked at the spine, put it back without opening it. She wasn't ready to think about that particular detail yet. The evening reading hour sometimes overlapped with Silas at the other end of the main room with his own book or his journal, and they'd sit in the kind of silence that had developed. She realized around the 5th week into something almost companionable. Not warm, exactly. More like 2 people who had separately agreed that silence together was preferable to noise alone. He didn't ask her more questions for a while. She didn't volunteer anything. They circled each other through the domestic routines of the house like 2 wary planets maintaining orbit, close enough that the pull was there, far enough that neither was in danger. She almost convinced herself this was sustainable. Then the second letter arrived. She didn't see it come in. She was in the root cellar behind the barn checking the potato stores when the weekly rider came through, and by the time she came back into the house, Silas was at the table with his coat still on and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not troubled exactly, but something that had moved past careful into something more deliberate. He looked up when she came through the door. He had the letter in his hand open this time, which the first one hadn't been when she'd seen it. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't unkind. It was the voice of a man who had decided the time for circling was finished. She sat down. She put her hands on the table. She looked at him directly because she had made herself a promise about that a long time ago, and she wasn't breaking it now. Not here, not with him. "This came from the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne," he said. "It's a correspondence relating to a federal investigation out of Ohio, into a land and investment fraud case." He watched her face. "The man who ran the scheme is named Arthur Price. Goes by other names. The investigation is still open." He paused. "They're looking for witnesses, and they're also looking for a woman named Clara Weston, who was named in 2 affidavits as someone who may have helped Price extend his operation." The kitchen was very quiet. "She didn't," Evelyn said. Silas didn't move. "The woman they're looking for," Evelyn said, with the steadiness of someone who has rehearsed this in their head 100 times and finds that rehearsal helps not at all. "She was one of his victims. She introduced other people to his scheme because she believed in it, because she had no reason not to. And then when she understood what had actually happened, she made the mistake of leaving before she could explain herself, which I'm aware is exactly what a guilty person would do, and I don't have a good answer for that except that she was frightened and alone and made a decision I'd make differently now." Silence. "She," Silas said. Evelyn's hands were flat on the table. "I." He looked at her for a long moment that had real weight to it, real duration. The lamp between them made shadows move slightly in the draft from under the door. "How long have you known that letter was looking for you?" he said. "Since the first one came." "That was 6 weeks ago." "Yes." "You stayed." "I stayed." She held his gaze. "Because I need this position. Because I've been running for a year and a half, and I'm tired of it. And because—" She stopped, looked at the table, looked back at him. "Because I didn't think you were the kind of man who'd hand a woman over to the law before he knew the full story. You were betting your freedom on that. I was. She paused. I'm still not sure I was wrong. Silas set the letter down on the table between them. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which she'd learned was what he did when he was processing something and didn't want his face to do it for him. Tell me the full story, he said finally, to the ceiling and then to her. So she did. She told him about Columbus, about her husband's death, about the 8 careful and lonely months after. She told him about Arthur Price, not the way she'd told it to herself in the dark, pared down to bitterness and self-recrimination, but the whole thing. The introductory meeting at a dinner party, the way he'd presented himself, the checks she'd made that had come back clean because he was very good at his work, the incremental investment, the growing confidence, the genuine excitement she'd felt about the returns, and how that excitement had felt good in a life that hadn't had much good in it. The way he'd made her feel intelligent, capable, like someone whose judgment was worth trusting, and how clearly she understood now that making people feel that way was specifically his skill. She told him about the collapse. The morning she'd arrived at the offices on Broad Street and found them empty. The letter from Sarah Henley, the investigator who'd come to her house and asked questions in a way that made her feel like the answers she gave were being heard wrong, twisted into a shape that fit a story someone had already decided to tell. She told him about leaving. The train to Pittsburgh, then west, a different name attached to herself, like a coat that didn't fit right, but kept the cold out. She told him about the employment agency in Denver, about the position at a Colorado ranch that had lasted 4 months before a man passing through said he was from Columbus and she'd left the next morning. And she told him about the letter from the agency offering a position in Wind River country, and how she'd sat in a rented room in Cheyenne and looked at it and thought, far enough, remote enough. A man in the mountains who needs a housekeeper and not a history. When she finished, the lamp had burned lower and the fire in the stove had settled into coals. She realized she'd been talking for a long time. Silas had not moved, had not interrupted, had not changed expression in any way she could clearly read. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he'd been watching her with since the day she'd arrived. That careful, patient attention with the purpose behind it that she'd never quite been able to name. Arthur Price, he said. You said he goes by other names. 3 that I know of, possibly more. She was startled slightly by the direction. When he ran the Ohio scheme, he was Price. Before that, a railroad investment operation in Missouri, he was a man named Calvert. Before that, I don't know. Do you know what he looks like? Very well, she said. 45, maybe 50 now. Medium height, slim build, pale blue eyes, the kind that look pale gray in certain light. He had a scar on the back of his left hand. She touched her own hand, indicating the web of skin between thumb and forefinger. Here. He wore a ring on the right hand. Gold, rectangular setting, blue stone. His voice is... She stopped. You remember a voice like that, even now. It's the kind of voice that makes you feel like you're the only person in the room and the room is warm. Convincing voice, Silas said. The most convincing I've ever heard, she said, which is saying something because I grew up around academics. He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands the way he did when he was thinking something through. She waited. She was very good at waiting. She had spent 1.5 years becoming expert at it. Your name, he said. Your actual name. Clara Weston. He said it quietly, like he was testing the weight of it. Clara, hearing her own name out loud, in this room, from someone who now knew it for what it was, it did something to her chest she hadn't anticipated. Some knot she'd been holding for so long she'd forgotten it was there. I know what this means, she said, keeping her voice level. If you need to send word to the Marshal's office, I understand. I'll leave in the morning so you're not placed in a difficult... I didn't say that, Silas said. She stopped. I haven't decided anything yet, he said. Don't start making plans. He picked up the letter. He folded it carefully, precisely, the way he did everything, and put it in his coat pocket. He stood up, moved to put more wood on the fire. I'll think on it tonight, he said, to the stove rather than to her. Get some sleep. She stayed at the table for a moment after he'd gone toward the stairs, the lamp making its small golden circle on the pine surface, and thought about what a strange thing it was to have said your own name out loud for the first time in 1.5 years and feel, alongside all the fear, alongside the calculation of consequences, something that was almost absurdly relief. She didn't sleep. She lay in the small room and looked at the ceiling and waited for morning the way you wait for a verdict. He came down before first light. She heard him on the stairs, heard him in the kitchen, heard the stove door and the sound of wood catching. By the time she'd dressed and come out, he had the coffee on and was standing at the kitchen window looking at the dark yard. He didn't turn around when she came in. "I'm going to tell you something," he said to the window, "and you're going to hear it out before you say anything." "All right," she said. "I've been working with the Territorial Marshal's office for 6 years," he said. "Not as a deputy, not officially, as a resource. Someone they correspond with when something comes through this part of the territory and they need eyes on the ground that aren't wearing a badge." He paused. "The first letter that came through, it wasn't just notification of an investigation. It was a request. They'd tracked a name to this area. They asked if I had any information. The kitchen was very cold. The stove hadn't warmed it yet." "The name they tracked," Evelyn said carefully. "Evelyn Hart, which was the name you'd given the employment agency in Denver." He turned from the window then. He looked tired, not from one sleepless night, but from the particular tired that comes from carrying something for weeks that has gotten progressively heavier. "I knew before you arrived, not who you were, not what the full story was, but I knew the name was being looked for, and I'd been asked to keep an eye open." She sat down, not gracefully. She sat because her legs decided to. "You hired me anyway," she said. "I did." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the correspondence from Cheyenne described someone being looked for in connection with a fraud case that 43 people had filed statements about. And the description of the woman in question didn't match any of those 43 statements as a perpetrator. It matched a victim." He sat down across from her. "I've been in this long enough to know the difference between how investigations describe criminals and how they describe people who've made themselves inconvenient to an investigation by disappearing. You were the second kind." "You could have been wrong," she said. "I've been wrong before," he said, with a flatness that meant it. "But you gave me 6 weeks. I gave you 6 weeks to be who you said you were," he said, "or to prove you were something different." He looked at her directly. "You were exactly what you said you were. Everything except the name." She looked at the table, looked back at him. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, "you tell me everything you know about Arthur Price. Every detail. The voice, the ring, the scar, the aliases. Any names he mentioned, any places, anything. And I write a letter back to Cheyenne that makes clear that what they have is a witness, not a suspect." Evelyn held very still, the way you hold still when something is either going to break or hold. "That's not a guarantee," she said quietly. "No," he agreed, "it's not. But it's the truth, and the truth is what we have to work with." He looked at her steadily. "You ran because you didn't trust the system to hear it. I'm telling you there's a man in Cheyenne who's been working this case for 2 years and wants Price, not a frightened widow from Ohio. Let me put the truth in his hands." She thought about Arthur Price's hands, elegant and steady and still. She thought about her father, who'd taught history, who'd said once that the only thing that changed a bad situation was someone deciding to do the harder thing. "All right," she said. Silas nodded, got up, poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat back down. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Take your time. I want everything." She wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten over the eastern ridge. That first pale gray before the gold, the sky deciding to try another day. She started from the beginning. "What?" They talked until the rest of the ranch woke up. Then she made breakfast and the crew came in and the morning proceeded the way mornings did on the ranch. With its particular combination of necessity and routine that had become, she realized, something she'd stopped calculating and started simply living inside. Doyle talked too much, as he always did. Cass ate deliberately and left without wasted words. Webb drank his coffee standing at the kitchen door, the way he did when the weather was turning, and he wanted to keep an eye on it. She moved through the familiar mechanics of breakfast service and watched them, and thought about what it would mean to still be here in a month. To be here, and to have a name that was her own. She caught Silas's eye once across the kitchen, and he held it for a moment. Not reassurance exactly, not promise. Just acknowledgement. "I know, I'm doing what I said." It was more than she'd had from another person in a long time. In the afternoon, he sat down with paper and wrote for a long while at the main room table. She could hear the scratch of the pen from the kitchen where she was working on the week's preserves. The early spring hadn't produced much yet, but she was extending what remained of last year's stores carefully. She didn't go look at what he was writing. It wasn't hers to see until he chose to show her. He showed her before he sealed it. She read it slowly. He'd written it in plain language, factual and precise, the way a man writes when he trusts the facts to speak for themselves. He'd explained the timeline of her arrival, the nature of the inquiry he'd received, what he'd observed over 6 weeks. He'd laid out what she'd told him about Price, the aliases, the physical description, the method of operation, as corroboration of witness statements he asked them to cross-reference. He'd stated, without qualification, that in his assessment and experience, the woman in his employ was a victim of the fraud in question, not a participant, and that she had relevant information about Price's current whereabouts and methods that warranted formal interview rather than arrest. At the bottom he'd written, "I am prepared to vouch for this assessment personally, S. Mercer." She stood with the letter in her hands for a long moment. "This puts your name on it," she said. "If they decide not to see it the way you've described, then my name is on it," he said. "I've been wrong before. I've put my name on things that didn't turn out. That's what it means to make a call." She handed the letter back. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that the words couldn't quite contain, which was the problem with words. They were usually the right size for ordinary things, and too small for the ones that actually mattered. He sealed the envelope and set it on the shelf by the door for the next writer. "Make something good for supper," he said, and went back outside. She stood in the main room a moment longer, the afternoon light coming low through the west window, and felt something she hadn't felt in a year and a half, something she barely recognized because it had been so long. She felt like herself. Not Evelyn Hart, and not even Clara Weston, exactly, but something underneath both names. The woman who'd been built by her father's history lessons, and her own long stubbornness and 18 months of cold roads and borrowed names. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, like that woman was still in there and had not been entirely consumed by the running. She went back to the kitchen and started supper. Outside, Silas was crossing the yard toward the barn, coat against the afternoon wind, not hurrying. The mountains behind the ranch were catching the late light the way they did in early spring. Gold on the snow, the peaks sharp and clear and enormous. She watched him through the window until he went through the barn door, and then she turned back to the stove. The fire needed tending. Supper needed starting. The week's stores needed finishing. She had work to do. She did it. The letter went out on a Tuesday. By Friday, Clara. She'd started thinking of herself as Clara again, in the private interior space where names actually lived, though she still answered to Evelyn in the yard and at the table, and didn't expect that to change anytime soon. By Friday, she'd decided that waiting was its own particular kind of work, and threw herself into the ranch's spring demands with the specific ferocity of someone who needed her hands occupied so her mind would stop chewing on the same material. The kitchen garden needed breaking. The soil behind the house had been left unturned since the previous autumn, and it was dense and cold and resistant, and she went at it with a mattock for 2 mornings in a row until her shoulders ached in a way that was almost satisfying. Doyle offered to help on the second morning, standing at the garden edge with his recently mended wrist and an expression of genuine willingness that she appreciated and declined. She needed the work to be hard. She needed to feel it. Silas watched her from the porch on the second morning, coffee in hand, saying nothing. She could feel him watching and didn't look up. After a while, she heard him go back inside and the screen door settle behind him. What she hadn't told him, what she hadn't told anyone ever, because it was the part that lived below the practical accounting of what had happened and why she'd run, was how it had felt to read her own name in an investigator's notebook. How it had felt to sit in her own parlor with a federal man across the table and understand with slow, terrible clarity that the story he was building had a shape, and her name fit into that shape in a way that had nothing to do with what she'd actually done. She'd spent her whole life believing that the truth was sufficient, that if you were honest and careful and behaved with integrity, the facts of a situation would speak for themselves. Her father had believed this. He'd taught it without teaching it directly, by the way he'd moved through the world with a kind of principled confidence that Clara had absorbed without understanding it, was contingent on circumstances she hadn't yet encountered. Arthur Price had been the circumstance, and the investigator's notebook had been the understanding. She drove the mattock into the cold ground and turned the soil over and breathed the particular smell of it, wet earth and old roots, and the mineral cold that meant winter was still in there, just retreating, and told herself that what Silas had done with that letter was a different thing, that a man who laid out facts calmly and put his name behind them was not the same as an investigator who'd already decided what story he was telling. She told herself this. She mostly believed it. Mostly was what she had. The reply came 11 days later. Not from Cheyenne, from a town called Riverton, 40 miles south, which meant the marshal's office had a man closer than either of them had known. Silas read it at the table after supper with Clara in the kitchen doing the washing up, and she knew from the quality of his silence that it was significant. He had different kinds of silence. She'd cataloged them without meaning to over the past 2 months. The working silence when he was occupied with ranch business, the thinking silence when something had his attention, and this kind, a focused, still quiet that meant he was reading something carefully and not letting his reaction get ahead of his understanding. She dried her hands and came to the kitchen doorway. He looked up. "Come sit down," he said. She sat. He put the letter on the table between them. His name is Marshal Lyle Beaumont. He's been running the Price investigation out of Riverton for 8 months, coordinating with the federal office in Cheyenne. He paused. He wants to come here. She felt the particular cold that wasn't temperature. When? He says he can be here within a week if I send word that you're willing to speak with him. Silas watched her face. It's your decision. He can't compel testimony at this stage. The warrant is for Price, not for you. But he believes what you know about Price's methods and descriptions could significantly advance the case. And my status, she said carefully, in his estimation. Silas picked up the letter and read from it directly, which he didn't usually do. He was a man who paraphrased, who processed and summarized, and the fact that he read it verbatim told her he wanted her to hear the exact words rather than his interpretation of them. He read that Beaumont had cross-referenced the information in Silas's letter against existing statements, that the timeline of Clara Weston's association with Price was consistent with victimhood rather than participation, that 2 other women with similar profiles had already been cleared of any investigative interest, and that Beaumont's current position was that Clara Weston was a material witness, not a subject. He set the letter down. That's not immunity, she said. No, it's not a formal document. It's one marshal's stated position. He folded his hands on the table, which could change depending on what else comes to light, or it could be exactly what it appears to be. You trust this man. It wasn't quite a question. He heard the shape of it anyway. I've worked with Beaumont twice, he said. He's careful. He's not interested in closing a case on the wrong person. He's interested in finding Price. He paused. He's also not soft about it. If you go into that conversation and something doesn't add up, he'll notice. He won't pretend he didn't. Good, Clara said, which surprised herself slightly. I don't need soft. I need fair. Silas looked at her for a moment. That's what I told him you'd say. She looked up sharply. In the letter, he said, with something that was almost an apology in it. I said I believed you were a woman who understood the difference between wanting protection and wanting justice. I may have overstepped. She thought about this, about the specific quality of a man who had watched her for 6 weeks and arrived at that characterization. You didn't overstate it, she said, but you should have asked me first. You're right, he said, simply, directly, without maneuvering. She was still not entirely accustomed to a man who could be wrong and say so without architecture. Send word to Beaumont, she said. Tell him to come. Well, she spent the days before Beaumont's arrival going through everything she remembered about Arthur Price in the systematic way she'd been afraid to do since Ohio. Not the emotional inventory she'd conducted in the dark of various rented rooms, but a structured, deliberate accounting. Dates, names he'd mentioned, places, even in passing. The bank he'd referenced in one conversation, the law firm on his letterhead, the name of the railroad contact he'd said could verify his credentials. She wrote it all down in a small notebook Silas gave her. Her handwriting was careful and tight. She filled 7 pages. She made herself write down the things that were harder too, how he'd operated socially, the specific way he'd constructed trust, the small vulnerabilities he offered, The moments of apparent honesty that made you lower your guard. The way he'd said once, with a rueful half smile, that he'd lost money on a bad investment himself in '68 and learned his lesson the hard way, and how she'd felt warmed by that admission, how it had made him seem real and fallible and therefore safe. She wrote that down. It was the part that shamed her most and was therefore probably the most useful. Silas read what she wrote each evening. He didn't comment on most of it, just read, nodded occasionally, sometimes asked a clarifying question about a detail. Once he asked her to describe the bank Price had mentioned, and when she gave him the name, he went very still for a moment, then wrote something in his own notebook. "You know it?" she said. "The name came up in something Beaumont sent me 6 months ago," he said. "Different context, but the same name." He looked at her. "That's useful." It was a small thing, but it was the first moment she understood that what she carried in her head wasn't just the wreckage of her own experience. It was evidence. It had shape and weight, and it connected to things she hadn't known she was connected to. This was different from being a victim. This was different from being a case. This was being someone with something to offer, and the difference mattered more than she would have predicted. Marshal Lyle Beaumont arrived on a Thursday afternoon that had decided to be genuinely warm for the first time all spring, as though the weather understood that some occasions deserved a better backdrop than Wyoming usually provided. He was shorter than she'd imagined. 50s, stocky, a gray mustache that needed attention, and the kind of eyes that were simultaneously tired and not missing a single thing. He shook Silas's hand in the yard with the ease of men who've dealt with each other before, and then he turned to her. "Miss Weston," he said. Her own name. "From a federal officer." She kept her face still. "Marshal, I appreciate you being willing to speak with me." He said it the way a man says something he means, but has also said many times, which is to say genuinely but without ceremony. "I know this situation hasn't been easy." "It hasn't," she agreed, and left it at that, because this was not a man who needed her feelings explained to him, and she didn't feel like performing them. Silas brought him inside. She'd made coffee and set out what she had in the way of food, cornbread and cold sliced beef, and the last of a dried apple preserve she'd been keeping, not to impress, but because a conversation this important deserved to happen at a table with something on it. They sat down. Beaumont took out a leather folder and a pencil and set them on the table without opening them yet. "I want to tell you where the investigation stands," he said, "before I ask you anything. I think you've earned that." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "All right." "Arthur Price ran 3 separate schemes over approximately 12 years that we can document," Beaumont said. "Possibly more that we haven't connected yet. The Ohio operation was the largest, 47 formal complaints, though we believe actual victims number closer to 90. Many people don't come forward on these things for the same reasons you didn't." He glanced at his folder, back at her. "He disappeared from Ohio in March of '78. We tracked him to Missouri, then lost the trail for 8 months. Picked it up again in Kansas. Lost it again. 2 months ago we had a sighting in Colorado, man matching Price's description operating under the name Harlan Cole. Preliminary stages of what appeared to be a mining investment solicitation." "Cole," Clara said. "That's a new one. Did you know a man by that name during your association with Price?" "No, but Calvert was the name before Price. His Missouri name. Cole fits the pattern. He likes names with hard sounds, short, easy to respond to naturally when someone calls them." She watched Beaumont write this down. He'd have practiced answering to it until it felt automatic. Beaumont looked up. "You've thought carefully about how he operates." "I've had 2 years to think about almost nothing else," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, assessing. Not unfriendly, professional in the way of a man who's learned that his feelings about any given person are less relevant than the facts they possess. "Tell me about the Colorado sighting." "I can't. I left Colorado before he arrived there, if it was him." "No, I mean, tell me what you know about how he would operate in a new territory. New name, new area, starting from nothing. What's his method?" She thought about this, about the dinner party where she'd met him, about the careful sequence of events that, looking backward, had an architecture so deliberate it was almost elegant. "He finds a legitimate social entry point first," she said. "A dinner party, a church social, a business association meeting, something that confers respectability by context. He attends several times before he discusses business. He lets people ask him what he does rather than telling them. Makes them curious first. She paused. He always has a small, visible loss to mention. Something that establishes he's human and honest about failure. And he has references, good ones, real names sometimes, real enough that if you write to verify them, the letter goes to a mail address he controls. Beaumont was writing steadily. How long does he typically take from first contact to first investment? With me, 4 months. I believe he moves faster with some people, slower with others who need more time. He's patient. He doesn't push. The ring, Silas said from his position at the corner of the table where he'd been quiet since they sat down. Tell him about the ring. Beaumont looked at her. Gold. Rectangular setting, she said. Blue stone. Could be a sapphire, but the color was too flat. I think it was glass. He wore it on his right hand. I noticed it early because it was distinctive and he never took it off. Not once in 6 months of contact did I see him without it. She paused. I wondered about it sometimes. A man who changes everything else about himself, his name, his history, his credentials, but keeps the same piece of jewelry. It's either a mistake or it means something to him. Beaumont had stopped writing. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Something sharper. The man we saw in Colorado, the man we believe may be Harlan Cole, he was wearing a ring. The kitchen went very quiet. Describe it, Claire said. I don't have that detail. The contact who spotted him wasn't close enough. He leaned forward slightly. But if it's the same ring, then you have something to look for, she said. Something he can't change without changing himself in a way that would cost him. She thought about it. It's a tell. The whole operation. The patience, the constructed legitimacy, the false references. It's meticulous. And in the middle of all that meticulousness, he keeps that ring. That's not rational. It's personal, which means something in his past gave it to him and he can't let it go. Beaumont sat back, looked at Silas, then back at her. Where did you get that read on him? My father taught me that the thing a careful person keeps irrationally is the thing that can find them, she said. He was talking about historical figures, but it applies. There was a pause that had a different quality than the silences before it. Beaumont picked up his pencil and wrote something she couldn't see from her angle. Miss Weston, he said without looking up, what you know about this man, the way he operates, the details you've just described, is more useful to this investigation than anything we've gotten from the formal complaint statements. He looked up. And I mean that practically, not as a courtesy. I know, she said. That's why I agreed to speak with you. He almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but it tried. I'm going to need you to provide a formal statement, written and signed, your real name, to be included in the investigative record. He paused. That's the point where things become official, where your name goes into a document that has legal standing. I want you to understand what that means before you agree. She looked at the table, at her hands, at the 7 pages of notes she'd made in the small notebook, sitting beside the cornbread and the coffee cups, and the spring afternoon light coming through the window. It means I stopped running, she said. It means you stopped running, he confirmed. She thought this moment, if it ever came, would feel more momentous. She'd imagined it arriving with the weight of a door closing or a judgment pronounced. Instead, it arrived over cornbread and cold beef in a ranch kitchen in Wyoming, and it felt less like a door closing than like setting down something heavy that she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight. I'll give you the statement, she said. They worked for 3 hours. Beaumont asked questions with methodical patience, and she answered them, all of them, even the ones that required her to describe her own failures of judgment in language that was clear and unsparing. She didn't editorialize. She didn't ask for sympathy. She gave him facts in the order they occurred and let him build whatever structure he was building. Silas stayed for the first hour, then went out to the ranch work that needed doing, and his absence was in some ways easier. She found she could speak more plainly without anyone in the room who knew her, even if knowing her had become, in this context, a complicated comfort. At the end of the 3rd hour, Beaumont set his pencil down and flexed his hand the way people do when they've been writing a long time. I'm going to be direct with you, he said. I'd prefer it, she said. Based on what you've told me today and what I can corroborate from existing statements, I have no grounds, and no intention to pursue you as a subject of this investigation. The two affidavits that named you were submitted by individuals who themselves had potential exposure and were, in my judgment, attempting to redistribute culpability. He said this flatly, not kindly, just accurately. I'll include my assessment in the record. It won't be an official exoneration because you were never formally charged, but it will be documentation that addresses the cloud on your name. She absorbed this. And the name Evelyn Hart. Assuming you discontinue using it and no crimes were committed under it. He looked at her, a question in the look. None, she said. Then it becomes irrelevant to the investigation. He closed his folder. Use your own name, Miss Weston. It'll serve you better. She walked him out to his horse in the late afternoon light. Silas was by the corral and came across the yard as Beaumont was mounting up. The two men spoke briefly, low enough that she couldn't hear all of it. She caught Riverton in 2 weeks in something that might have been a name she didn't recognize. Then Beaumont tipped his hat at her and rode south down the track, and the afternoon settled back into the particular quiet of a Wyoming evening approaching. Silas came to stand beside her. They watched the rider diminish down the track. How do you feel? He said. It was the most direct personal question he'd asked her in 2 months, and it caught her off guard enough that she answered honestly without thinking about it first. Like I walked through something that was waiting for me and I'm on the other side and I'm not entirely sure yet what the other side looks like. He was quiet for a moment. That's about how it usually feels. Does it get clearer? Some, he said, given time. They stood there in the cooling air with the mountains catching the last of the light, turning that particular shade of blue that happens in the high country when the sun drops behind the ridgeline and the sky hasn't decided yet what it's going to do next. You should have told me, she said, when I arrived, that you knew, that you were working with Beaumont. I know, he said. It would have... She stopped, thought about it honestly. It would have terrified me. I would have run. I know that too, he said quietly. She turned and looked at him. He was still watching the mountains the way he did, that particular quality of attention that was neither escaping into the view nor absent from the conversation, just present in both places at once. Why did you hire me anyway? She said. Really, not the practical answer. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, because I read that letter and I read a description of someone who had made one bad choice, trusting the wrong person, and spent 2 years punishing herself for it by running. And I thought, he paused, turned and looked at her directly. I thought that was a waste of a capable person, and I thought maybe what was needed wasn't investigation. It was somewhere to land. She held his gaze. The light was going amber now, long and low across the yard. That's a significant assumption to make about a stranger, she said. I've been wrong before, he said, for the second time since she'd known him. Were you wrong this time? He looked at her. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one. The careful version, the one that didn't commit to more than it meant. No, he said. I don't think I was. She turned back toward the house. Her legs were tired and her hands ached from 3 hours of gripping tension she hadn't quite released, and she needed something to eat and probably an hour in the small room with the door closed. Just being a person who wasn't performing anything for anyone. Supper in an hour, she said. I'll be in, he said. She went inside. The kitchen was warm from the afternoon fire, the coffee cup still on the table where she and Beaumont had worked, the 7-page notebook sitting where she'd left it. She picked it up, held it for a moment, and put it in the pocket of her apron. Then she built the fire back up and started supper, and used her own name quietly to herself while she worked. Clara. Not Evelyn. Not a borrowed coat against someone else's cold. Clara Weston, standing in a kitchen in Wyoming making supper with both feet on the ground. It felt strange. It felt right in the way that things feel right, that you've been without long enough to forget you were missing them. She burned the first batch of biscuits because she wasn't paying attention. She made another batch and those came out fine, which was how most things went. The first attempt going wrong not because you were incompetent, but because you were somewhere else in your head, and the second working because you'd come back. Outside she heard Silas and Webb at the corral, low voices and the sound of a gate. Doyle somewhere in the far distance doing something he was probably not supposed to be doing. Cass's slow step on the bunkhouse porch. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening on a working ranch in a Wyoming spring. She listened to them and let them be exactly what they were. The formal statement went to Cheyenne by Tuesday's rider. Clara watched the envelope leave with the same feeling she imagined people had watching a boat push off from a dock. That specific moment when the thing is no longer in your hands and the water is between you and it, and whatever happens next happens without your direct participation. She went back inside and washed the breakfast dishes and told herself the waiting was simply another kind of work. It wasn't easier than the other kind, but she was practiced at it. The ranch moved into its late spring rhythms around her. Calving season wound down. The range work intensified as Silas pushed the herd to higher pasture, and the crew's schedules shifted accordingly. She saw less of the men during the day and more of the ranch in its quiet working state, which suited her. She expanded the kitchen garden, put in a second row of beans and a section of turnips that Cass claimed he didn't eat, but she noticed he always finished. She rendered the tallow she'd been saving and made enough soap to last the ranch through summer and probably into fall, which gave her a satisfaction that was entirely out of proportion to the task. Silas came in for supper each evening. They talked, carefully at first, the way people talk when a significant thing has happened between them, and neither is entirely sure how to recalibrate to it, like two people who've seen each other in a crisis and now have to figure out what Tuesday looks like. But the conversations lengthened, the topics widened. He told her about the early years on the ranch, how he'd come out from Pennsylvania at 28 with enough money to make a mistake and enough stubbornness to fix it, how the first winter had nearly ended the whole enterprise, how the land had taught him things that hadn't been available to him anywhere else, which wasn't something he said romantically but practically, the way he said most things. She told him about her father's history classes, about a professor who'd believed passionately that ordinary people made history, and that the ordinary people who got left out of the official accounts were usually the most interesting ones. She told him about learning to read Latin at 11 because her father thought it would be useful, which it had been exactly once when she'd needed to decipher a land document in Columbus, and the lawyer across the table had been visibly unsettled by the fact that she didn't need him to. Silas had laughed at that. A real laugh, quiet but genuine, and she'd felt something in the room shift slightly on its axis. She didn't examine this too carefully. She had enough to manage. Beaumont's second communication arrived 2.5 weeks after the first. It was addressed to Silas, but he brought it directly to the kitchen table and opened it while she was still in the room, which she understood was a deliberate choice. The man seen in Colorado had been confirmed as Arthur Price. The ring had confirmed it. A contact in the Colorado Springs area had gotten close enough to describe it, and the description matched what Clara had provided in her statement with enough specificity that Beaumont had written exact match with 2 underlines in the margin of his letter. "He's still there?" Clara said. "As of 3 weeks ago." Silas read further. "Beaumont wants to move carefully. Price has bolted before when he sensed pressure. They're trying to build enough of a case locally that when they move, it sticks. He needs more witnesses," she said. "He needs better documentation of the current scheme. He has the history, but a smart defense attorney will argue each operation separately. That a man can't be tried for Ohio and Colorado." He set the letter down. "What he needs is evidence that connects them, that establishes a pattern that crosses jurisdictions." Clara looked at the letter, at the line about the ring. She thought about Arthur Price's hands, the ring glinting in lamplight at a Columbus dinner party, and the way it had caught her eye for a second, and she'd thought, that's a man with an attachment to something. She'd filed it away the way you file away small observations that don't seem significant until later, much later, when the shape of everything has changed and the small things reveal themselves as load-bearing. "The references," she said. Silas looked at her. "He uses real names, people he's researched who can't easily be contacted, men who've died or who are in remote areas or who are prominent enough that a letter of inquiry might not reach the actual person." She was pulling this from the 7-page notebook in her memory now, the way she'd reconstructed it, the architecture of his method. But he uses the same types of names, the same tier of social respectability. Lawyers, minor politicians, established businessmen, and he'd have to use names that are verifiable enough to seem legitimate, but not so easily reached that someone actually confirms the reference quickly. How would that help Beaumont? Because if the references he's using in Colorado follow the same pattern as the ones he used in Ohio, and some of those names are the same or similar, that's the connective tissue. She leaned forward. I remember 4 of the names he gave as references to people I spoke with. I wrote them in the notebook. If Beaumont compares those to whatever references Price, Cole, is using in Colorado Springs, you think he's recycling them. I think he's careful about most things and lazy about a few. The ring, and probably the references, because building convincing references takes significant effort, and if they worked once, the temptation to reuse them in a different geography would be hard to resist. She paused. He would have calculated that victims in Ohio aren't communicating with investors in Colorado, and he'd be right usually. Silas picked up his pen. Write them down again, the 4 names. She wrote them from memory, handed him the paper. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at her. I'll send this to Beaumont today, he said. There's something else, she said. I should go to Riverton. He set the pen down. I should be available to Beaumont directly, she said, before Silas could say whatever he was composing. Right now, every piece of information I have travels through letters and riders, and there's days of delay in each direction. If I'm in Riverton, I can answer questions immediately. If he needs me to work through the details with him in real time. It's a 2-day ride, he said. I know how far it is. Beaumont hasn't asked you to come. Beaumont doesn't know everything I know, she said. He knows what I put in the formal statement. There are things I held back, not deliberately, things I didn't think were relevant at the time. The more I think about Price's method, the more I think some of those details matter. She held his gaze. I spent 2 years being afraid of being useful to this investigation. I'm done being afraid of it. He was quiet for a moment that had its own particular weight. I'll take you, he said. You don't need to. Beaumont knows me. If you arrive alone, it takes time to establish trust in the context. If you arrive with me, we save 2 days of that. He said it flatly, practically, the way he delivered most things. But she heard the other layer under it, the one that wasn't about efficiency. She didn't argue, partly because he was right about Beaumont, and partly because she was not. She admitted to herself in the honest interior space where she kept her clearest thoughts, entirely opposed to having Silas Mercer riding alongside her. When? She said. Day after tomorrow. That gives me time to leave instructions for Cass. He got up, put on his coat, took the paper with the 4 names toward the door for the afternoon rider. Clara, he said at the door. Using her name, her real name, the one he'd known for weeks now but still used sparingly, carefully, as though it was something that required handling with appropriate attention. She looked up. You're sure about this? I've been sure about very few things in the last 2 years, she said. This is one of them. He nodded once and went out. They left before first light, 2 days later, with the stars still faint and the horses blowing steam in the cold morning air. Clara had packed a single saddlebag. She'd ridden before. Her husband had kept horses in Columbus, and she'd ridden enough over the years to be competent rather than graceful. But she hadn't ridden hard or long in several years, and she didn't mention this. She didn't need to. After the first 2 hours, Silas checked his pace without comment, and she didn't thank him for it. They rode mostly in silence. Not the loaded silence of the early weeks, but the easier kind. 2 people who have said the important things and don't feel compelled to fill the space between conversations. The landscape was big enough that silence inside it felt natural, almost required. The Wind River Range ran along the western horizon for the first day's ride, close enough to feel present and large enough to make everything below it seem proportionally small, which Clara found oddly comforting. She thought about Arthur Price for a long time as she rode, not with the old, sick dread that had transmuted into something harder and more useful, more like the cold-focused attention she'd brought to setting Doyle's broken wrist. The problem of Arthur Price as a problem to be solved rather than a wound to be carried. She thought about the ring, about the name Calvert, and then Price, and then Cole, the progression of identities like a set of coats in increasing states of wear. About the thing Beaumont had said, he's bolted before when he sensed pressure, and what that meant about how to approach the situation in Colorado Springs. Push too hard and he'd dissolve again into whatever geography was largest and most forgiving. But Price was also, she had come to understand, a man who underestimated the people he'd already used, on the theory that victims were too ashamed and too scattered to coordinate. He'd never had a victim who came looking for him, who sat across a table from a marshal and laid out the architecture of his method with the specific anger of a woman who'd spent 2 years learning exactly how it worked. He'd miscalculated that. She rode and thought and let the Wyoming space do what it did to her. Open something up, clear something out, remind her that the world was larger than any single disaster in it. Quote, Riverton was a working town rather than a prosperous one, functional, a little rough at the edges, the kind of place that served the surrounding territory without much concern for how it appeared doing it. Beaumont's office was on the main street, above a land title company, the kind of shared building that made sense in a town where resources were spread thin and practicality outweighed dignity. Beaumont looked up when they came through the door and didn't look surprised, which meant Silas had sent word ahead. "Miss Weston," he said, and then looked at her face and added, "You have something." "Several things," she said. "I'd like to start with the references." They sat down, the three of them, at the map table in the center of the room. Beaumont spread out what he had on the Colorado Springs operation. Not much yet, mostly observation and early testimony from 2 investors who'd become suspicious and come to local law before losing significant money. He had a partial list of references Price had provided. Clara looked at the list. "Read it twice." "The 2 of these names," she said, pointing, "are on my list." Exactly. One of them was a state senator from Indiana who died in '73. Price used him in Ohio because he was prominent enough to be recognizable, dead enough not to contradict anything, and Indiana-based enough that an Ohio investor wouldn't have a direct line to verify. She looked up at Beaumont. "He's using the dead senator again." Beaumont wrote something. "The second name is a law firm in Chicago that dissolved in '69, she said. Price had letterhead, very good letterhead, with an address that redirected to a mail drop. He'd have updated the address for Colorado, but the firm name would be the same." She pointed. "There. That's it." Beaumont looked at the name on his list, at the name she'd written, at both of them. "That's the connection," he said. "That's the connection across 3 jurisdictions," she said. "Ohio and now Colorado. If there are records from the Missouri operation, working on getting them." Beaumont looked at Silas. "How long can you stay?" Silas glanced at Clara. The question was partly for her. "As long as it's useful," he said. They stayed 3 days. Clara had not expected 3 days. She'd expected a conversation, a handshake over transferred information, the clean transaction of what she knew becoming what Beaumont could use. What she hadn't expected was the sustained collaboration, the way Beaumont worked, pulling a thread and following it and coming back to her with the next question, building the case the way you build a structure that needs to stay up in bad weather. She answered everything. She stayed at it through long evenings at the map table while Silas handled the correspondence and the communication with Cheyenne. She went back through her memory of Price's social method and found things she hadn't known were there, details that had sat in peripheral storage for 2 years and emerged when the right question was asked. The way he'd always insisted on meeting at establishments he chose, which she realized now was about controlling the environment and who might see him. The fact that he never conducted business in writing if he could avoid it. Everything verbal, everything deniable. The one time she'd seen him flustered, briefly, when a man at a dinner party had mentioned a specific banker in Cleveland by name, and Price had covered it smoothly, but not before the flinch had happened. "The Cleveland banker," Beaumont said, leaning forward. "I don't know his significance, but Price reacted. We have a complaint from a Cleveland investor filed in '77. Never followed up because the man died before we could get a statement." He looked at his notes. "Banker named, don't tell me," she said. "Write it down and show it to me, and I'll tell you if I recognize it." Beaumont raised an eyebrow, wrote it, showed her. She looked at the name for a long moment. That was the name of the banker Price mentioned at the dinner party, the one that made him flinch. "He knew him," Beaumont said. "Or he owed him something, or feared him." She pushed the paper back. "Either way, that's a thread you haven't pulled yet." Beaumont sat back and looked at her with an expression she'd seen on him once before. That sharpened attention, the look that meant something had just connected that hadn't been connected before. "Miss Weston," he said, "I need to ask you something direct, and I need a direct answer." "All right. Would you be willing to provide testimony in person if this case goes to trial? In Colorado or in federal court, wherever the prosecution lands?" The room was quiet. She could hear the street noise below through the floorboards. A wagon, Someone calling out, the ordinary town sounds. She thought about standing in a room where Arthur Price was present, where he would look at her with those pale, near-gray eyes, and that voice would be deployed in her direction, and she would have to hold herself exactly as steady as she was now and say every word she'd just said clearly and without flinching. She thought about this for a moment that was very long from the inside. Yes, she said. Beaumont nodded, wrote it down. Then let's make sure what you have is airtight. They worked until past 10 that night. She was tired in a way that went down to the bone, the kind of tired that is also relief. The two things wound so tightly together she couldn't separate them. At some point, Silas put a plate beside her elbow. Bread and cold meat from somewhere. She didn't ask where. And she ate without looking up from the documents, and he went back to his own section of the table without comment. At 10:30, she sat back and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed out. That's everything I have, she said. Beaumont looked up from what he was writing. He set his pen down. He looked at the organized spread of notes and referenced documents and cross-checked timelines on the table, and then he looked at her. That's a case? He said simply. She didn't answer. She looked at the documents. 2 years of fear and running transformed into a structured argument on paper. At a dead senator from Indiana and a dissolved law firm in Chicago and a gold ring with a blue glass stone and a banker's name that had made a careful man flinch. She was very tired, and the work was done, or the beginning of the work was done. The rest would happen in places and times she couldn't control, which was something she was going to have to be at peace with. Silas came and stood beside her chair. Not close, just near. Ready? He said. She took her hands from her face, looked at the table one more time. Yes, she said, and meant it in more than one direction. They walked out into the Riverton night, the street quiet and cold, the stars overhead doing what stars did in this high country, burning clear and sharp and completely indifferent to what happened beneath them, which Clara had come to find not cold but honest. The world didn't arrange itself around human trouble. It just kept going, and there was, she thought, something steadying in that. They walked back toward the boarding house without talking. Their steps matched on the board sidewalk without either of them adjusting for it. She didn't mention this. Some things were noted in the quiet and left there. They rode back to the ranch in weather that couldn't make up its mind. Warm 1 hour, a thin cold rain the next. The sky doing the indecisive thing it did in Wyoming spring when the seasons were still negotiating terms. Clara rode with her coat buttoned to the throat and her hat pulled low and didn't complain about any of it, which Silas noticed and didn't comment on, which was the kind of dynamic they had settled into without either of them declaring it. The ranch looked the same when they came up the track on the second evening. Same low profile against the mountains. Same woodpile. Same 4 horses in the corral standing in the rain with the philosophical patience of horses who have learned that weather is not a problem to be solved, only endured. Doyle came out of the barn when he heard them, took the horses with minimal words and maximum curiosity about what had happened in Riverton, and received minimal information in return because neither Clara nor Silas was in the habit of explaining themselves to a 20-year-old who would have the whole story distributed across the bunkhouse within the hour, regardless of how much he was told. She went inside, built the kitchen fire back up, made coffee from what was left in the tin, which was not much and produced a result that was more suggestion than substance, but it was hot, and she drank it standing at the stove with both hands around the cup and let the familiar smell of the kitchen do what it had been doing for months now, settle something in her that the road and the uncertainty kept moving around. Silas came in after seeing to the horses himself, the way he always did regardless of who else was available. He sat at the table. She poured him the last of the weak coffee without being asked. Beaumont will send word when something moves, he said. I know. She sat down across from him. I'm not going to spend the next 3 months standing at the window waiting for the rider. No, he agreed. You're not that kind of person. She looked at him. What kind of person am I? He turned his cup in his hands. The kind who burns the first batch of biscuits because she's thinking about something important and makes a second batch because the thinking doesn't stop her from doing what needs doing. He said it without decoration, just placed it there on the table between them like a fact he'd been holding for a while and had decided to set down. She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the rain had picked up, hitting the kitchen window in irregular gusts. The fire in the stove popped once, settled. That's a very specific observation, she said. I've been watching you cook for 4 months. You've been watching me for longer than that, and you know it." He didn't deny it. "Yes," he said, "I do know it." The kitchen was quiet enough that the rain was loud. She looked at the table, at the grain of the wood she'd scrubbed so many times she knew its texture without looking, and thought about what it meant to be known. Not the frightening version of it, the being seen through, the exposure, but the other version. The one where someone has paid attention to the actual you, the imperfect and complicated actual you, and hasn't looked away. She hadn't known those were different things until they were. "What happens to this position," she said carefully, "if the investigation resolves and I'm formally cleared and there's no longer any reason for me to be here under any particular arrangement?" "That's a complicated way of asking a simple question," Silas said. "I'm a complicated person. I know that too." He looked at her directly. "The position exists because the ranch needs the work done. That doesn't change based on what Beaumont's office puts in a report." He paused. "But I think you know that's not entirely what you're asking." She met his eyes. "No, it's not entirely what I'm asking." He was quiet for a long moment. Not the thinking silence, not the working silence. Something else, something more deliberate, like a man choosing his words with the same care he'd use handling something that mattered. "I hired a housekeeper," he said slowly. "That was the arrangement. That was what made sense." He stopped, started again. "What I know now is that I hired a woman who is considerably more than that designation covers, and I'm aware that I don't have a good vocabulary for saying what I mean here, which is a problem I'm going to have to work around." She almost smiled. It came and went quickly. "Try anyway." "I don't want you to leave," he said, simply, without ornament. Not because the kitchen would go back to the way it was, though it would, because the house would go back to the way it was. And I've gotten used to the way it is now. He looked at her. "I'm not good at this kind of conversation. I want you to know that I'm aware of that." "You're doing adequately," she said. "High praise." "It is, from me. You know that." He almost smiled back. Almost. "I know that," he said. The rain came harder for a minute, drumming the roof, and then eased. Clara looked at the window and back at him and thought about all the things she'd learned in the past 2 years, about what she actually needed versus what she'd thought she needed. She'd thought she needed safety, and she'd been right, but safety had turned out to be a more complex thing than absence of threat. She'd thought she needed invisibility. She'd been wrong about that entirely. What she'd needed, it turned out, was somewhere that required her to be fully herself. Somewhere the full weight of her, the stubbornness, the competence, the Latin she'd learned at 11, the particular fury she was capable of, the capacity for careful feeling she'd been keeping on a very short leash, was not too much. Where it was, in fact, exactly enough. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I want you to know that I know that about myself." "I've noticed," he said, without any particular alarm. "I have opinions about how things should be done. I don't defer well. I've noticed that too. And I'm not the same person who left Ohio," she said. "And this part was harder. This part required the specific honesty that costs something. I'm not sure all the changes are improvements. I'm more cautious than I used to be. I'm slower to trust. Some of that is probably permanent." He looked at her steadily. "I'm 41 years old and I've been alone on this mountain for 5 years," he said. "I'm not without my own permanent damage." He paused. "I don't think that disqualifies either of us from anything. I think it's just what it looks like when a person has lived past 30 and paid attention." She exhaled. A small sound, but real. "All right," she said. "All right," he said back. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The fire in the stove breathed its small rhythm. The rain eased further, going from determined to half-hearted to the particular Wyoming quiet that follows weather, that clean silence of a world that's been washed down and is deciding what to do next. She got up eventually and started making something for supper out of what was in the kitchen, which wasn't much after 4 days away. She found eggs and some dried sausage and the tail end of a sack of cornmeal, and made do with what she had, which was what she always did. Silas sat at the table and read through the mail that had piled up while they were gone, and the kitchen had its sounds. The stove, the pan, the rain finishing itself against the window. And they shared the space the way they'd learned to share it, comfortably, without performing it. She burned the eggs slightly. She didn't apologize for it. He ate them without comment. The The word from Beaumont came 6 weeks later. Arthur Price, operating as Harlan Cole in Colorado Springs, 3 months into a mining investment scheme that had already collected pledges from 14 investors, had been arrested on a Tuesday morning at a hotel on Cascade Avenue. The ring had been on his finger. The arrest had gone without violence, which Beaumont noted with the dry satisfaction of a man who's seen enough arrests go otherwise to appreciate when they didn't. The letter was 2 pages. Clara read it at the kitchen table with the morning light coming in from the east window, and Silas stood at the stove with his coffee, and she read it through once completely and then set it down. "They have him," she said. "They have him," Silas confirmed, though he'd already read it. She sat with that for a moment. 2 years, 2 months, and some number of days she hadn't exactly tracked because at some point the tracking had become less urgent than the living. And now a Tuesday morning in Colorado Springs, and a man in a hotel room and a ring that had given him away because he couldn't leave it behind. She thought about what that meant. That Price had been meticulous and careful and brilliant at the architecture of deception, and in the end what had unraveled him was something he'd held onto that he shouldn't have. Some attachment he couldn't cut. And she thought, not for the first time, that this was the way most things came apart. Not through dramatic failure, but through the small persistent thing a person couldn't let go of. And she thought this applied to more than criminals. She thought about herself, holding on to her father's voice in her head through 2 years of running, holding on to the particular integrity that had made her set Doyle's wrist and fix the pantry hinge and refuse to go through Silas's papers even when she was afraid, holding on to the version of herself that hadn't been entirely consumed by what Arthur Price had done to her life. The thing she couldn't let go of had also been the thing that brought her through. That seemed worth noting. "The formal statement," she said, "but the testimony. Beaumont will need it now." "He says the federal prosecutor will be in contact about scheduling," Silas said. "It may be several months before it goes to trial. These things move slowly." "I know. I'll be ready when it does." She folded the letter, held it. 47 formal complaints, she said quietly. Probably 90 actual people. Yes. He won't be able to reach all of them. Even with the arrest, some of them are still out there not knowing it's over. She thought about that. The particular isolation of a person who is running from something and doesn't yet know the thing they're running from is stopped. "I know what that feels like, the not knowing." "You can't find them all," Silas said. "No, but Beaumont can put the arrest in the wire reports, get it into the newspapers that circulate. People will see it who need to see it." She set the letter down. "I want to write to Beaumont and suggest that. Make sure the notice goes wide." "Write it," he said. "I'll get it on the next rider." She got up for paper and the pen and stood at the kitchen table composing the letter with the same careful handwriting that had always been hers, the one she'd carried through every name and every address and every rented room, the one thing about Clara Weston that no alias had ever been able to fully replicate. She wrote to Beaumont clearly and directly, and signed her name at the bottom, Clara Weston, with the same pen in the same hand and without any hesitation at all. She sealed it, handed it to Silas. He looked at the name on the outside. "How does that feel?" he said. Not teasing, actually asking. "Like mine," she said. "It feels like mine." The trial was in October, in a federal courthouse in Denver that was larger and colder than Clara had expected, with high ceilings that made every sound echo and a formality to the proceedings that was alternately reassuring and suffocating. She testified on a Thursday. She wore the best dress she had, which was not very grand, and her good boots, which were, and she walked to the stand with the particular quality of stillness she'd been building since Ohio. Not the stillness of a frightened person holding themselves rigid, but the stillness of a person who has decided what is true and is prepared to say it clearly in any room. Arthur Price was at the defendant's table. She'd known he would be there. She'd prepared for it the way you prepare for something you cannot avoid, not by making it less real in your imagination, but by making it more real, thinking through it until the fear of it was a known shape rather than an unknown one. He was older than she remembered. Of course he was. 2 years, plus whatever the arrest and the holding had done to him. The elegant hands were still. The pale eyes found her when she walked in and held on her for a moment, and she felt the specific quality of his attention, that trained, deliberate warmth that was not warmth at all, but the performance of it. And she looked directly back at him and felt nothing shift in her chest. That was the moment she understood she was finished being afraid of him. She testified for 3 hours across 2 sessions. She answered every question directly, completely, without editorializing or emotion that the facts didn't warrant. She described Arthur Price's method from the inside, how it felt to trust it, how the trust had been constructed piece by piece, what had made it credible. She described the dinner party, the incremental investment, the false references, the ring. She described what she'd lost. When the defense attorney asked her with the particular edge of a man who thinks discomfort is the same as dishonesty, whether she had left Ohio under an assumed name, she said yes. When he asked whether that suggested she had something to hide, she said, "It suggested I was frightened of exactly what you're doing right now, Shakes, taking a victim's reasonable fear and presenting it as evidence of guilt." The judge let it stand. Several of the jurors wrote things down. When it was over, she walked out of the courthouse into a Denver afternoon that had decided to be beautiful without consulting anyone's preferences, clear and cold, and that specific high-altitude blue that you don't get at lower elevations. Silas was on the steps. He'd been in the gallery, but she hadn't let herself look for him while she was testifying. He handed her her coat without comment. She put it on. "How bad was it?" he said. "Less than I expected," she said. "He's smaller than I remembered. In person. Actually, in the room." She looked out at the street. "I think I made him larger in my head because that's what fear does. It expands the thing." "What does he actually look like?" "Like a man who's run out of new names," she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you hungry?" She almost laughed. Not quite. It came out as a short exhale that had something like a laugh in it. "Remarkably, yes," she said. They found a place near the courthouse that was warm and not expensive and served food that was adequate rather than memorable, and she ate with the specific appetite of someone who has been running on tension for 3 days and has just been permitted to stop. Silas ate across from her and didn't fill the silence with anything unnecessary, which she had come to understand was one of his best qualities, and not a small one. "Whatever the verdict is," she said, over coffee at the end of the meal, "I want you to know that it doesn't change how I feel about the last several months. About what I—" She stopped, chose the words carefully. "About what I found here. Whether Price is convicted or whether a defense attorney manages to find a crack in the case and he walks out of there and disappears again." She looked at Silas. "I came to Wyoming running from something, I know that, but what I found there wasn't a hiding place. It turned out to be something else entirely, and I want to say that clearly." He looked at her across the table. "What did it turn out to be?" "Home," she said, simple and true and not dressed up as anything more complicated. "It turned out to be home." The word landed between them and sat there. He looked at it, at her, for a long moment with those gray, careful eyes that had been watching her since the day she'd walked through his gate. "Good," he said. "Quiet, direct, certain. That's what I intended it to be." The jury returned a verdict 11 days later. Guilty on 9 counts of fraud across 3 jurisdictions, with additional charges pending from the evidence connecting the Missouri operation. Beaumont sent word by telegram to the ranch. Silas had invested in a telegram relay to Lander the previous year for exactly these kinds of communications. And Clara read it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in November, with the first real snow of the season falling outside the window in thick, purposeful flakes. She read it twice, set it down, picked up her coffee cup. Silas was watching her from the doorway. 9 counts, she said. "Yes, 47 formal complaints, and he'll answer for 9 counts, she said. There was something tired in this, not angry exactly, but honest about the limits of what justice actually looked like when you put it in a room and asked it to operate under the constraints of procedure and evidence, and what could be proven versus what was true. "That's how it works, I suppose." "That's how it works," he agreed. "He'll do significant time regardless." "I know." She looked at the telegram, at the clean factual language of it. "I wanted him to answer for all of them, all 90. All the ones who didn't file statements, all the ones who were too ashamed or too far away or who didn't know there was somewhere to file." She paused. "I wanted the system to hold all of it." "It rarely does." "No." She set the telegram down. "But it held enough." She got up and went to the window and looked at the snow coming down over the ranch. The corral, the barn, the woodpile disappearing under white, the mountains behind everything wearing their winter weight again. The same view she'd had since March, and it had not become a small thing to her the way familiar views sometimes did. It remained large and specific and genuinely beautiful in the way of things that don't care whether you appreciate them. She'd spent 2 years looking for a place large enough to lose herself in. What she'd found instead was a place large enough to find herself in, which was different and better and harder, and she hadn't expected it. She hadn't expected Silas or the particular shape of what honesty looked like when it was practiced by 2 people simultaneously and without much natural grace. She hadn't expected to care about a 20-year-old ranch hand's wrist or a Cherokee cowboy's preference regarding chili peppers or the satisfaction of a root cellar organized exactly right. She hadn't expected to stop running and discover that what was on the other side of running wasn't rest, it was just life, actual life, with its daily requirements and imperfect people and work that needed doing, and the very occasional morning when the light came through the east window and lay on the kitchen floor in bars of gold, and everything was, for a minute, exactly what it should be. "Silas," she said to the window. "Yes, I'd like to stay through next winter." She turned around. "And the one after that?" He looked at her from the doorway. Something in his face had loosened, very slightly, in the particular way of a man who has been waiting for something and has finally heard it. "The position is yours," he said, with the ghost of the formality they'd started with, and the ghost of a smile underneath it. "The position," she said, "is not the point." "No," he said, "it isn't." He crossed the kitchen toward her, not hurrying, the way he did everything, with the unhurried purpose of a man who has calculated the distance and is confident about arriving. He stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to look at him, which she did without stepping back. He reached out and took her hand. Her right hand, the one with the ink stain on the middle finger from 3 days of testimony notes, and held it in both of his, which were large and scarred and cold from the morning outside. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, to the name, to the question in it, to whatever came next. Outside, the snow fell on the Wind River Ranch with the same democratic generosity it fell on everything. The corral and the mountains and the track going south and the crossroads where a woman had stood in the frozen spring with a bag at her feet and a borrowed name and nothing else, deciding to walk toward an unknown gate rather than back down an empty road. That woman had been wrong about some things and right about others, and she was still sorting out which was which. She'd made bad choices and good ones, and some that she still couldn't fully classify. And she'd lived with all of them in the specific way you live with the weight of your own history when you stop running. Carrying it, because it doesn't go away, but carrying it differently. Not as a sentence, as the thing that made her who she was. Which turned out to be, in the end, enough. More than enough. It was everything.